these trees here. It shows these two trees in nature. Here, we, the chordates, are most closely related to the arthropods, or the insects. But according to this other molecular study, we're way off here, and the insects are more closely related to roundworms. Now, these are not trivial issues in molecular or evolutionary biology. So, the inconsistencies in evolutionary trees based on molecular comparisons have to actually be explained away in the light of evolutionary theory. They actually don't provide evidence for the theory. Now, I'm not saying the theory is proven false, but this certainly doesn't provide evidence for it. Now, according to reviewer Wiley, who reviewed the minority report, these discrepancies do not challenge the view that all living organisms are related through common ancestry. Reviewer Bartolt wrote something very similar. And while I can't necessarily prove them wrong, I mean, maybe we really all are related through common ancestry, and we just haven't figured out how to make the molecules tell us the true story. At the very least, we can only say this based on some other form of evidence. We're not getting it from the molecules. So what other forms of evidence do we have? Well, the other two forms generally proposed are the fossil evidence and the embryology evidence. So that's what I'll talk about next, the fossil record. According to the minority report, sudden bursts of increased complexity, such as the Cambrian explosion, challenge the Darwinian view that we're all related through common ancestry. Now, in Darwin's theory, this is a very simplified cartoon of it. The phyla that I showed you a few minutes ago are up here, and if we had a good fossil record, which of course we don't, we would expect to find something like this in the past, where these branch off somehow from a common ancestor that might be, for example, some form of worm. Ideally, this is what we would expect. When we go looking at the fossil record, what we find instead is this. Most of the major animal phyla appear abruptly, geologically speaking, in the Cambrian explosion, with no fossil evidence that they actually came from a common ancestor. Theory versus evidence. Now remember, common ancestry might be true at lower levels, but at this level, the level of the animal phyla, the fossil evidence certainly isn't helping us. Darwin himself recognized this. He said this actually presented a serious problem, a valid argument, suddenly appear in the Cambrian must at present remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against his view of common ancestry. I would argue, as a biologist, that the problem has not been solved in the intervening 150 years, at least not from the fossil evidence. Now, reviewer Wiley criticizes people who think the Cambrian explosion is a big deal. He says it is not, and they, myself I guess, would know this if they actually examined the recent literature. Well, I have examined the recent literature. For example, Wiley cites two articles in 1996 that rely on molecular studies, there we are back to that, to date the original divergence of the animal phyla to about 1,200 million years ago, or about 700 million years before the Cambrian explosion. The problem is, other molecular studies, true to form, come up with a very different answer and give us a date much closer to the fossil record. According to Berkeley paleontologist James Valentine and his colleagues, now these are not intelligent design proponents. These are not creationists. These are actually not even people who doubt Darwin's theory in the larger sense. But these paleontologists, who are experts on the evidence, say the accuracy of molecular clocks is still problematical, at least for the phyla, since the estimates vary by hundreds of millions of years depending on the techniques used, so they do not muffle the Cambrian explosion, which continues to stand out as a major feature in animal evolution, contrary to reviewer Wiley. Reviewer Wiley then cites two other articles reporting fossil evidence for animals before the Cambrian explosion. What's interesting is that one of the articles he lists is considered an extremely dubious interpretation of fragmentary data by other experts in the field. The second article is at best controversial. So here we have two articles dubious and controversial, up against literally hundreds of articles documenting the dramatic and extensive nature of the Cambrian explosion. And we're supposed to accept the Cambrian explosion based on these two articles. Well, I'm not persuaded. Clearly, Darwin's tree of life does not fit the fossil evidence for the origin of the major groups of animals. Finally, number 3, embryology. I love this part because I'm an embryologist primarily. For Darwin, the best evidence for his theory was embryology. He said the embryos of the most distinct species belonging to the same class, such as mammals, are closely similar but become, when fully developed, widely dissimilar. This is by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of my theory. Actually, by class at that point, Darwin meant phyla. And to illustrate Darwin's point, a colleague of his in Germany, Ernst Haeckel, made this drawing in 1868. And many of you I'm sure have seen it or some version of it. Here's a fish, a salamander, a turtle, chick, 4 mammals. And in Haeckel's drawing, they all look almost identical in their early stages. And the lesson from this that Haeckel drew and Darwin himself drew was that this shows all of these share a common ancestor. And in fact, for Darwin, the common ancestor probably looked something like that. Problem is, Haeckel faked his drawings. He was known to have faked his drawings at the time. His colleagues accused him of fraud. If you look at the actual fish, amphibian, turtle, chick, human embryos, if you look at them at this stage and draw them from life, they look more like that. This is what I saw as a Berkeley graduate student and realized that there was something wrong here. Well, reviewer Miller, when he comments on this part of the standards, admits that the early embryonic stages were incorrect, and he says, textbooks have long been corrected now to reflect Richardson's observations. Well, Miller did correct his book somewhat. I'll get back to that in just a minute. But here are 2 textbooks from 2004. Biology textbooks, copyright dates 2004, and there are Haeckel's embryos. Here's a biochemistry textbook from 2004. This is for graduate students. Well, maybe not. Upper division undergraduates, perhaps. And there are Haeckel's embryos. So yes, they have been removed from some textbooks, but certainly not from all. Reviewer Theobald says, it's true that the embryos were faked, but that does not invalidate the fact that development is more similar between 2 animals the more recent is the common ancestor between them. In other words, the main point is still true, according to Theobald. Wiley takes a similar view. The more recent the common ancestor, the more similar the development. And reviewer Miller likewise argues that the principle is true even if the drawings are wrong. And Miller then takes the minority report to task for telling students that vertebrate embryos differ in ways that they do not. Well, here's the picture from Miller's book. He uses photographs. He certainly cannot be accused of faking drawings here. In their early stages of development, chickens, turtles, and rats look similar, providing evidence that they shared a common ancestor. So the principle for Miller is still true. But let's take a closer look at the evidence. Choosing embryos only from certain classes and then distorting them to make them look similar was not Haeckel's main fault. Even more significantly, he didn't even show the earlier stages of vertebrate embryos. He started in the middle. If you look at the earlier stages of vertebrate embryos, here's the stage Haeckel made look very similar. If you look at earlier stages, the patterns are extremely divergent. Mammals, for example, begin their cell divisions in a way totally, radically different from the other classes. So instead of, and here's a comment from a Dartmouth embryologist to this effect, this is not a secret in the community of embryologists. It's only by semantic tricks and subjective selection of evidence, by bending the facts of nature, that one can argue that the earliest stages of vertebrate embryos are more similar than their adults. Instead, what we really have with the evidence is what is now called by developmental biologists the developmental hourglass. Okay? The embryos start out very different. They converge in the middle for reasons we do not understand, and then they diverge again as they grow older. Well, remember Miller's pictures. These are photos now. They can't be accused of being doctored. But look at where he got them. He picked the three most similar of these 5 embryos. He left these out. Picked the 3 most similar at this stage where they're the most similar, and he called this the earliest stage. And then he accuses the Minority Report of telling students that embryos are more or less similar than they really are. Now here's another textbook. I honestly don't know if Miller's book is in use in Kansas, but I know this one is. This is Biology, the Dynamics of Life. No, I'm sorry, that's next. This one here, I don't have the book with me, but Campbell, Williamson, and Hayden has this set of pictures. Well, same thing again, okay? These are taken from the 2 most similar at this stage and represented as evidence that embryos are most similar in their early stages, which is absolutely false. Now, I was going to hold another book up which does the same thing, but I think the point is made. So I'll summarize. Recent challenges to universal common ancestry. The molecular data do not yield a consistent pattern of evolutionary relationships. The fossil record of the Cambrian explosion certainly does not fit the branching tree pattern of Darwin's theory, and embryos are not most similar in their earliest stages. So my conclusion is there are discrepancies between Darwin's theory of evolution and the evidence from molecules, fossils, and embryos. Science students should know about them. Thank you.
Dr. Wells, sort of a follow-up question. I believe it is indicator 1F. That your PowerPoint slide just covered. The view that living things in all major kingdoms are modified.
Yes, F1, 2, and 3. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, would you comment on the scientific validity of indicator 1F, 1, 2, and 3?
The Minority Report's proposal. Yes. Well, certainly the evidence supports them. I mean, there may be a pedagogical question, should high school students be exposed to this? But given the usually, the way Darwinian evolution is often presented as though there's overwhelming evidence for it and no dispute about it. Clearly that's not the case. So I do think students should be exposed, at least in outline, to these problems.
Would it be fair to say that exposing students to this information would improve their understanding of biological evolution?
It would improve.
And when I say understanding is meant in terms of comprehension, being able to comprehend the subtleties of the theory so that it can be more reasonable.
Okay, well, remember, I didn't use the term biological evolution.
Okay.
I used the term Darwinian evolution. If by biological evolution you mean the fact that we see that living things are different now than they used to be, this evidence certainly increases a student's knowledge of that pattern of difference. What does it do to Darwin's theory? Well, I think it weakens Darwin's theory. The evidence weakens Darwin's theory. But for science, that's good. If the theory doesn't explain the evidence, then it should be weakened in the eyes of the students. They shouldn't be told something explains evidence that isn't there. They should be aware of the evidence.
We were just talking about the definition of evolution. I'd like to take your attention up to indicator 1A, where the Minority Report adds a couple of sentences to the definition of biological evolution.
Okay.
And asked you to comment on the two additional sentences in indicator additional specificity 1A.
Well, honestly, I would not call it biological evolution there, because for me that term is too broad. I would have written that Darwinian evolution, or Darwin's theory of evolution. And if it were written that way, I would say it's absolutely true, at least in Darwin's mind. Remember, my first PhD was on the 19th century controversies, and I actually wrote a book about Darwin's view of teleology and guided evolution. And it was very clear that the process of evolution was unguided. So if by biological evolution you mean Darwinian evolution, then this is a fact. historical fact.
So if you were to substitute the word Darwinian evolution, in your opinion anyway, the statement would be a scientifically valid statement?
Historically true, yes. And that's not just Darwin himself, but his followers, with rare exceptions. That one?
Okay, and indicator 3D, there is a discussion of micro and macro evolution, and a distinction is made in the minority report which you would not find in the mainstream report.
Mm-hmm.
My first question is whether it is appropriate to make the distinction between micro and macro evolutionary changes, and then whether 1D, in your view, is a scientifically valid teaching.
Well, I was fascinated to read the review by Hurd. Hurd wrote in his peer review of the minority report, quote, "I am confident that there are other qualified commentators who will have pointed out the absurdity of differentiating macro and microevolution, terms which have no meaning outside of creationist polemics." Well, I don't know Mr. Hurd, but this statement is wildly false. The terms micro and macroevolution were first used by neo-Darwinist Theodosius Dobzhansky in his 1937 book, Genetics and the Origin of Species. And I'll just quote a few sentences here. "There is no way toward an understanding of the mechanisms of macroevolutionary changes which require time on a geological scale, other than through a full comprehension of the microevolutionary processes observable within the span of a human lifetime and often controlled by man's will. For this reason, we are compelled at the present level of knowledge, reluctantly, to put a sign of equality between the mechanisms of macro and microevolution, and proceeding on this assumption to push our investigations as far ahead as this working hypothesis will permit." Now, the terms macro and microevolution are found throughout the evolutionary literature, right up to the present day. And what's interesting is that this problem that Dobzhansky pointed to, that we actually can't get a handle on macroevolutionary processes without extrapolating from microevolution, this problem is still with us, and it's highly controversial among biologists. On the way down here, was finally getting a chance to read a very good book. It came out in 2003. It's called Origination of Organismal Form. Now, these are eminent evolutionary biologists. As far as I know, there's not an ID proponent in there, certainly not a creationist. As far as I know, all of them have a faith that sooner or later completely natural explanations will be found for all these phenomena. But to a person, these writers say quite clearly that there's a problem extrapolating microevolution to macroevolution, a scientific problem. It's just undeniable. It's throughout the scientific literature. Maybe I could comment briefly on one term that appears in that paragraph, irreducibly complex.
Yeah.
Another reviewer, Theobald, wrote in his review of the minority report that, quote, "The term irreducibly complex is not found in the scientific biological literature, and the concept is not used by real research biologists. Rather, it is a term from the pseudoscientific publications of intelligent design proponents." Well, this isn't quite as wildly false as Hurd's statement about micro and macroevolution, but it is false nevertheless. As far as I know, the first person to use the term irreducibly complex in the biological literature was Michael Katz of Case Western Reserve University. And he used it to describe, maybe I can just read it briefly, natural systems that cannot be reduced to smaller precursors. And Katz regarded them and their existence as a serious problem for Darwinian evolution. Now, Lehigh University biochemist Michael Behe got quite notorious when he proposed intelligent design as an explanation for irreducible complexity. But the phenomenon of irreducible complexity is independent of that explanation and pre-exists in the biological literature. It is not a term coined by intelligent design advocates.
Is it fair to say that the argument that this system is irreducibly complex is essentially a challenge to neo-Darwinism or to the adequacy of natural selection?
Absolutely, and Darwin himself acknowledged that. Although he did not use the term irreducibly complex, he wrote in The Origin of Species, if it could be demonstrated well, we went from all to nothing. Are we still here? If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And he's talking there about the same thing that Katz was talking about.
There have been a lot of scientific criticisms that the idea of irreducible complexity has been completely refuted. Could you comment on that?
I can comment briefly, but I just haven't been able to keep up with the now voluminous literature on that subject. But there's a long and ongoing debate between Mike Behe, Scott Minnick, and various other people on the one side, and Ken Miller and various other people on the other side, as to whether a specific feature is irreducibly complex or not. And I think that's a legitimate controversy. I mean, maybe it is and maybe it isn't.
It hasn't been resolved.
Oh, no, it hasn't been resolved. It's continuing. But that controversy is actually distinct, as I said, from the explanation one provides to try to account for the irreducible complexity once it's established that it's there.
Now, is that information that would be the fact that there is that controversy over that issue? A pretty deep controversy, I gather. Is that something that would help, that kind of information would aid the students' understanding of what you would call it Darwinian evolution? We call it here biological evolution.
Well, it would certainly aid in their understanding in the sense that they would know there's a controversy over whether Darwinian mechanisms can account for irreducibly complex systems, if such exist. There certainly is a controversy over that.
Dr. Wells, I believe you're familiar with the Ohio curriculum that has been developed by the state of Ohio. If you could just briefly explain what that curriculum is, why it was developed, and would parts of that curriculum support the proposed changes in the minority report that are reflected in this benchmark 3, standard 3?
Well, I have read the Ohio curriculum. I don't claim to be an expert on it or to know it intimately, but it's certainly, I think, a model for how evolution should be taught if the schools have the time to do it. This particular curriculum, I think, takes estimated duration 4 to 6 hours of class time, which, given the purported importance of evolutionary theory in modern biology, I think should be well worth it in a biology curriculum. But the Ohio curriculum goes into quite some detail, presenting the arguments and evidence for and against various aspects of Darwin's theory. And it provides an appendix with an annotated bibliography, sample questions and answers, study guides. I mean, it's really a valuable resource, and I commend it to the state of Kansas if and when you get around to doing something like that.
I believe there will be other witnesses that will testify about that, and will at a later point in time introduce copies of the Ohio curriculum. Dr. Wells does not have those with him, but Dr. Wells does have with him some written testimony that he will hand to the committee and the recorder and Mr. Irganagari.
May I have that written report now if he's going to rely on it for any purpose whatsoever, please?
Beg your pardon, sir?
I would like to have his written report if he's going to rely or has relied on it for any purpose.
Well, we will provide that to you, yes.
If he has it, I'd just like to have it so I may be able to question him.
It's up to you, Jim.
Yeah. If we have it, sure. Dr. Wells, in conclusion, could you explain why you believe the state of Kansas should implement the proposed revisions in the Standard 3, Benchmark 3 of the high school science standard?
Yes, very briefly, although I have indicated my disagreement possibly with a word or two in the actual phrasing of things. I think it's a valuable addition to the standards because it alerts teachers and students to problems with evolutionary theory, Darwinian evolutionary theory, that are very real and currently very controversial within the biological community. And I think it actually makes the whole study of evolution far more exciting when students know about that, rather than just having to memorize things by rote, which is one reason why, in the beginning, I emphasized the process of science rather than the learning of specific explanations.
Thank you very much. I believe Dr. Wells is open for questions.
I have a few questions for you, sir. You are the same Jonathan Wells as the individual that is the senior fellow at the Center for Renewal Science and Culture, the acronym CRSC.
That was the former acronym. That was the original name of the center. It's now the Center for Science and Culture, CSC.
Which was a branch of the Discovery Institute?
It's one of the programs at Discovery, yes.
Which is a privately funded conservative think tank based out of Seattle?
It's a privately funded think tank. It actually includes a lot of people who would not consider themselves conservative.
It is true, is it not, that it believes that science in general and the theory of evolution in particular are responsible for materialistic, atheistic philosophy whose destructive cultural consequences in our society must be reversed?
I'm not sure where you're getting that statement.
Do you agree with that statement?
No.
So you disavow that statement?
I do not think science is responsible for cultural materialism. I think a misuse of science is responsible for it.
Is it your opinion that science today, particularly mainstream science, represents that which I have read?
A large number of scientists today would subscribe to the sort of view that I think is being criticized there, but that's a sociological statement, not a statement about science per se.
Is it true that the CSC, give me that acronym now, please.
Center for Science and Culture, CSC.
It's been changed to CSC. When was that change made?
A couple of years ago. I'm sort of on the edges of it as a research fellow, so I'm not directly involved in their day-to-day activities.
You certainly were involved with it when it was the CRSC.
I was a senior fellow then, yes. Uh-huh.
And it is true that as part of the former CRSC strategy, now the CSC, the wedge was a strategy for replacing science as it is currently practiced with intelligent design, which is a theistic science which would allow supernatural causes. That is true, is it not?
True of what?
Of what the former CRSC, now the CSC, had as a goal through the wedge.
I don't know. I don't know that document you're referring to.
Are you familiar with the wedge?
I have heard of it.
You have just heard of it?
I read some version of it years ago. I haven't seen it since. But my own view and the view of the people I work with is not that science is the culprit here. Materialist philosophy in the guise of science is the culprit.
And who do you allege are materialist philosophers?
Well, I could name some names. Daniel Dennett, for example.
Are you suggesting that the majority of scientists in the United States and the world that adhere to the theory of evolution may be defined as such?
I wouldn't know how to evaluate that. I certainly couldn't evaluate it outside the United States. I do know that several of the professional societies that I belong to in biology do have statements like that as policies.
Is it your belief that mainstream science is biased against your views?
If by mainstream you mean the majority of currently practicing scientists, and you, by bias against my views, I assume you mean my criticisms of evolutionary theory, as in icons of evolution, the answer would be yes. Most of them disagree with me. I am definitely in the minority, which is why I'm here supporting the Minority Report.
That's pretty obvious. You are in the minority.
I enjoy being in the minority. I'm more comfortable being in the
More
minority.
than being right?
More than you? I missed that, I'm sorry. I prefer to be right. If that means I'm in the minority, so be it.
Now, sir, it is true, is it not, that the former CRSC, now the CSC, has as its long-term agenda to extend intelligent design into all aspects of the culture, as their name indicates, to hope to renew science and culture in some sort of a mix?
I'd say that's true, yes. But the method by which that's intended is to have intelligent design win on the scientific grounds.
It is true.
It's obviously a long way from having done that at this point.
It is true, is it not, that as a member of the Discovery Institute, you first joined in 1996?
I became a senior, well, the center was founded in 1996, yes. I forget the exact date when I became a senior fellow. I moved to Seattle in 1998.
Is it true that as early as the 1970s you were a member of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church?
Yes.
And is it a fact that while involved with that church, you became convinced that evolution was false because it conflicted with your church belief that humankind was specifically designed by God?
I became convinced that Darwinian theory is false because it conflicts with the evidence.
You keep using the term Darwinian evolution. You would agree, would you not, that since Darwin, the science of evolution has advanced greatly?
Well, then I would include in that neo-Darwinian evolution, which is just Darwinism combined with genetics.
You keep using Darwinism and neo-Darwinism. Isn't it, in fact, the science of evolution that we should be speaking about and not using terms that are intended to simply draw a reaction? If we're interested in speaking about science?
I prefer to be precise. The problem is the term evolution, as several speakers before me pointed out, is vague. I mean, it can mean change over time. I've seen it defined in textbooks as a change in gene frequencies. Well, that's not correct. My children have different gene frequencies from mine, and they haven't evolved.
Please answer my question, Dr. Wells.
I'm trying to be precise about the definition of evolution.
It is true, is it not, that since Darwin 150 years ago, the science of evolution has advanced greatly. As an example, Darwin had no knowledge about genetics, did he?
No, he didn't. That's why I said neo-Darwinism is Darwin's theory combined with modern genetics. Neo-Darwinism. So it's true, I could say neo-Darwinian evolution. That would actually be more accurate in this situation. So I'll say neo-Darwinian evolution.
Is that the manner in which you would broadly paint all sciences involved in evolution as neo-Darwinist?
Absolutely not. I just held up a book of people who say neo-Darwinism fails. And they would call themselves evolutionary biologists in some general sense. So that's why I am specifically criticizing neo-Darwinian evolution, Darwinian evolution for shorthand.
After you received your degree in biology, you did immediately go to work for the Discovery Institute, did you not?
No, I didn't. I worked for several years as supervisor of a medical laboratory in California.
Doing what?
Supervising a medical laboratory.
Doing what?
Well, not only laboratory tests. Actually, I've been a medical laboratory technologist for about 25 years. But as supervisor, I had to schedule people. I had to supervise quality control. I had to maintain the computer system. So in addition to my bench duties, I had these administrative duties as well.
Dr. Wells, do you have a personal opinion as to how old the Earth is?
I think the Earth is probably 4.5 billion or so years old. But I'll tell you this, I would have said a few years ago, I'm convinced that it's 4.5 billion years old. But the truth is I have not looked at the evidence. And I've become increasingly suspicious of the evidence that is presented to me. And that's why at this point I would say probably it's 4.5 billion years old, but I haven't looked at the evidence.
You do accept, do you not, common descent within species?
Within a single species, of course. I don't know anyone who doesn't.
What about among species?
Among species? Well, I stated in my PowerPoint that I find it extremely unlikely, based on the evidence, that the animal phyla are related through common ancestry. Other biologists have said they're dubious of common ancestry at levels higher than that. The levels in between, I don't know. As a scientist, I would have to say each case would have to be settled based on the evidence.
What about between humans, the human species, Homo sapiens, and other species such as prehominids?
I think it's extremely unlikely, based on the evidence.
You would agree that that opinion is a rather insignificant minority that believes that?
Well, I don't feel insignificant, but I've already conceded that I'm a minority, yes.
Obviously not insignificant.
If someone could show me a mechanism whereby an ape-like creature could turn into something like a human, I would accept it. But I've looked and I haven't found it. Not even remotely close.
It is important, is it not, to keep science neutral as far as faith is concerned?
Well, faith is a loaded word, but I'll say yes for the sake of argument. I find lots of faith in science, actually. Faith in common ancestry, for example.
And the fact that someone is involved in the study of the natural process in a scientific process, that does not, in your mind, equate to that individual not being able to maintain a religious faith which is compatible with science and evolution.
I see no problem at all. In fact, the world's greatest scientists were very religious people, including the world's greatest biologists. Except for Darwin.
To your understanding, is there anything in the standards that prevent teachers from discussion of the sort of issues and evidence and controversies you have raised?
Certainly nothing positively discourages them. What I find discouraging in the existing standards is the tone of Darwin only. We're going to present Darwinian evolution as though it were the explanation.
Where in the standards does it say that only Darwin theory is to be taught?
It doesn't have to, because it presents only Darwin's theory. And I'm not actually suggesting that it present other theories. I'm not. I'm suggesting that the standard should include at least a nod to the fact that there are problems between this explanation and the evidence.
It is true, is it not, that a gentleman named Paul Nelson, together with Mr. Johnson and others, were instrumental in the early days of intelligent design?
Philip Johnson, Paul Nelson, yes. Uh-huh. They're
I like-
still involved in it.
I'd like to read a quote to you from Mr. Paul Nelson. Intelligent design proponents offer nothing to the scientific community upon which a scientific program can be developed. They don't even have clearly defined definitions of critical terms that can be understood and applied by others. For example, they have provided no objective basis upon which others can apply concepts such as irreducible complexity or specific complexity.
Specified.
They focus on critiques of evolutionary theory that either attack strawman views of evolution, misrepresent current science, or are simply based on flawed reasoning. They also point to areas of frontier science in which the scientific community is yet to reach a consensus. None of this constitutes any challenge to the predictive and explanatory power of evolutionary theory. In short, with regard to intelligent design, there is nothing there. There simply is no theory of ID or anything approaching it. ID is not used in scientific research, even by its primary proponents. All ID is a series of failed and rejected criticisms of evolutionary theory. Easily, the biggest challenge facing the ID community is to develop a full-fledged theory of biological design. We don't have such a theory right now, and that's a real problem. Without a theory, it is very hard to know where to direct your research focus. Right now, we've got a bag of powerful intuitions and a handful of notions, such as irreducible complexity and specified complexity. But as yet, no general theory of biological design. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about that quote. It is true, is it not, that there is no such thing as an ID theory?
I wouldn't say that. By the way, I don't think all that's from Paul Nelson.
It is true, is it not, that there is no ID theory?
I just said no, I don't believe that.
You believe that there is a definable theory of intelligent design?
Yes, I do. It's certainly in progress. I would not advocate putting it in the curriculum for reasons other people have given here. It's a young theory. It hasn't proved itself. It doesn't deserve a place in the curriculum as a requirement. But it's an exciting theory, and I think a robust one. And not all of that is from Paul Nelson.
And would you agree that intelligent design must in the end conclude that a designer was involved?
And a mind, yes, a designing mind. If something is actually designed, then a designing mind had to do it.
But you're not suggesting it was design of man, are you?
Designed by men?
Yes.
Well, certainly before humans appear on the scene, no, it couldn't be.
So the answer which ID attempts to provide is a supernatural one, is it not?
I won't go there, and here's why. I've said already, I do not think science benefits from defining ahead of time the sorts of explanations that it can find. There are already scientists, respected scientists in this country, who do experiments on things that most people consider supernatural, such as prayer. When Newton proposed his theory of gravitation, it was dismissed as supernaturalism because it was action at a distance. What constitutes supernaturalism in today's science may very well not be supernatural in tomorrow's science. That's why I emphasize the process of testing hypotheses against the evidence.
I understand, sir, but there is a difference between looking at nature and asking questions versus looking at questions and because we cannot find an answer at the moment, assuming that it had to be an intelligent designer.
That's not how intelligent design works. Intelligent design is not an argument from ignorance. What it does is it sets certain criteria by which we normally, in the course of our daily lives, determine whether certain things are designed or not. And then it argues that that can be extended to features of the natural world. Obviously, that's a controversial claim, but I think it's a legitimate one.
I have nothing further.
Thank you for coming, Dr. Wells.
Thank you for inviting me. I love controversy.
Irreducibly complex. Where did that term originate, or where in the research did that start showing up?
As far as I know, and I actually gave you a handout about it,
I noticed that, and I can study it later if you feel like I'm going to get my answers there.
Well, it's just documented there. I mean, it's
Good.
the citation is there.
Okay,
But as far as I know, the first use of it was Michael Katz of Case Western Reserve University.
Around what year?
1986. I'm sorry if that's what you were asking. 1986, which was 10 years before Michael Behe used the term.
Okay. Now, this prebiotic soup that we discussed earlier, there was a speck that landed in the soup. What's the scientific term for that? Is it a cell? What is it that we just discovered, or they were saying was irreducibly complex? What's the term? Was it a cell?
You're talking about origin of life researchers, what they would say?
I don't even know. I'm just wondering, what was the first piece of life?
First piece of life.
According to Darwin, what was it called?
Well, Darwin was not clear on this. He didn't pretend to know the answer. He talked about a warm little pond, but he didn't really deal with it. One modern evolutionary biologist, Carl Woese at the University of Illinois, years ago thought that he could show that all the domains of life, the major domains, were related, but came to the conclusion just in the last few years that they were not, that they emerged separately from this primordial soup, or whatever you want to call it, and that the soup itself consisted of a mixture of complicated molecules that interacted sort of like living things, but not quite like living things. Now, I'm trying to represent Woese's position. It's not my position, so I'm not sure I've got it right, but he would say something like that.
Okay, what has been discovered to be reducibly complex?
Well, something reducibly complex would be anything that would continue to function after you take certain parts away from it. Irreducibly complex means that those parts are necessary for the functioning. You remove any one of them, and the thing that you're talking about stops functioning. That's irreducible complexity.
Okay. I'm going to pass the mic for now and see if I can get my question posed. Thank you.
Dr. Wells, you state that neo-Darwinian evolution and biological evolution are not the same. How are they different?
Well, they're often conflated, as they have been here. But I know people who would call themselves evolutionists who distinctly disavow neo-Darwinism. So there has to be a larger class of evolutionists in some general sense of, living things have changed over time by some mechanisms which we don't yet know, as opposed to neo-Darwinian evolutionists who think that the change happened by neo-Darwinian mechanisms. So there's a distinction in the scientific community.
Okay, I understand that the thought about neo-Darwinian evolutionists, but if someone calls themselves a biological evolutionist, what does that imply, or how is that different?
Well, I think you'd have to ask each individual. It might mean, for example, they believe in universal common ancestry. So everything shares a common ancestor, but the mechanisms of change are something other than what Darwin or neo-Darwinians propose. But you'd have to ask each individual what he means by that, or she means.
Why would you say that, as has been stated before, and you have stated also, that the word evolution is a rather slippery word? Why is that? Why don't we be distinct and specific?
Well, I try to be. I really do try to be. Evolution,
in the science field, it is not generally considered to be distinct and specific.
Well, often it's a throwaway word. It's just a word you put out there, it's just part of the jargon. If you're dealing with a specific aspect of it in a scientific writing, then usually you define that aspect and zero in on what that is. Very few biologists would say, I am not an evolutionist. In a general sense, I'm an evolutionist, but I'm definitely not a Darwinian or neo-Darwinian evolutionist.
What would you say, or can you state what the hypothesis of the theory of neo-Darwinian evolution is?
Yes, I'll do my best. First of all, Darwin's theory, and this is an extension of that, Darwin's theory is that descent with modification. All living things share a common ancestor, and they have become modified through natural selection acting on random variations. Now, the only addition in neo-Darwinism is that the variations are explained by recourse to genetic mutations, genetic differences. So it's natural selection acting on genetic variations causes things to evolve from a common ancestor. That would be it in a nutshell.
As I understand it, when Albert Einstein was first trying to bring out his theory of relativity, he was made a prediction that light would actually bend, and that was unknown at the time. And he made this prediction, stepped out there and made it, and in a few years, certainly it found that that light can bend. Therefore, he stepped out, and that was an act of falsification. He was able to state this hypothesis.
He took a risk.
Stated a prediction, and it either proved it false or it substantiated it. Mm-hmm. And it substantiated it at that point in time. It was not proven false. Mm-hmm. So, with that in mind, the prediction that with the hypothesis of neo-Darwinian evolution, that there is common ancestry, why doesn't the analysis, the evidence that about the 18S RNA tree versus the 28S RNA tree falsify that? Why doesn't that do that?
In my opinion, because neo-Darwinian evolution has left the realm of science. It now functions as an assumption, an underlying given, a dogma. It cannot be falsified. Nothing will falsify it because it's just a given. It does make predictions. I would argue that virtually every prediction it has made above the species level has been falsified in the sense you just described. And yet the theory is still with us. And I would argue that that is evidence for its non-scientific nature. Now, why should it be taught in the science class? Because sociologically it is still part of science. I just think it should be taught fully.
Thank you very much. Delia.
Thank you for telling us a little bit more about intelligent design. We have a lot of people addressing us and saying, well, this is not science. And why? And when I say, well, I think it has scientific basis, they still argue that it's not science. Can you address any of that? Why is intelligent design science then?
Well, it's interesting. If you read the evolutionary literature, at least before the last few years when this started brewing more heatedly, Darwinian evolutionists have consistently argued against design. Darwin himself did. Hundreds of pages in The Origin of Species are devoted to arguing against design. The argument was the evidence will show that what looks like it's designed can actually be explained by natural processes. Now, if evidence can show that something is not designed, then in principle, evidence can show something is designed. You can't have it both ways. You can't say suddenly, well, you can't argue for design because all of a sudden that involves something supernatural. Darwin was excluding the supernatural and claiming that the evidence justified it. I would say if you're going to resort to evidence on one side, you can resort to it on the other. And for me, that's all intelligent design does. It says the evidence we see points to design. Where we go beyond that is a theological question. Well, I'm also a theologian, so I love those questions, but that's not science for me.
We appreciate you being here, too. It's been fascinating to hear some of your comments and your remarks.
Thank you.
I just have a brief question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. You had a reference to Darwin's, I believe, one of his books, and it went on, concluded by saying, would absolutely break down. Is the reference to that quote in the material you gave us?
It is. It's in the supplement K on irreducible complexity. And it's from The Origin of Species, Chapter 6.
Okay. What was it that he said was irreducibly he didn't say irreducibly complex,
didn't
but what
use
was
that
he
term.
talking about? If that ever broke down, or if that ever was termed to be irreducibly complex, then his theory would break down. That's my paraphrasing.
Okay.
What was that thing he was talking about?
If anything could be shown to be like this? you
Yes.
mean? Anything at all. The eye, the hand, the human person, a leaf, any feature he was speaking specifically of the biological world, but any feature that could be shown not to have been formed by numerous slight successive modifications, then his theory would absolutely break down. Could be anything in the living world. What's interesting is all it takes is one. One example, and Darwin's theory is finished, according to Darwin himself. An intelligent design theorist, you might know, does not need to see everything as designed. We follow the evidence where it goes. If it's designed, fine. If it's not, that's what the evidence shows.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wells.
Dr. Abrams, it looks like if we go ahead and start with Dr. Semmett, we might be able to not have to stay beyond 5:30. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to go ahead and call Dr. Semmett. Dr. Abrams, members of the committee, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Bruce Semmett. And Dr. Semmett, I want to welcome you and thank you for traveling all the way from the fair state of Minnesota, Wisconsin, I guess it is.
No, don't go there.
No, Minnesota.
Thank you.
Minnesota, okay. Would you further introduce yourself and give us a bit of information about your background?
First of all, I'm not a cheesehead. My name is Bruce Michael Semmett. I'm currently at Northwestern College in St. Paul, Minnesota. My background starts with University of Minnesota Duluth, where I gained my bachelor's degree in biology and chemistry. I then went to the Duluth Medical School and got my master's degree in human physiology with biochemistry. After that, I did a research project there and then moved on to the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis and did my PhD work in the Department of Medicine and the Department of Physiology in human physiology and biochemistry, and biochemistry as a minor, but almost a second major. My thesis research was delving into the nuclear site of action of thyroid hormone and how it turned on specifically messenger RNA and the genome itself. After the University of Minnesota, I went to work for the U.S. government at the VA Medical Center in a postdoctoral position looking at toxicology and specifically looking at how to modify specific therapeutic drugs that could be used as cardiotonics to reduce arrhythmias as well as to reduce bronchocongestion for asthmatics. In that experience, I learned how specific biomolecules really were in the human body in a therapeutic fashion, and how the slightest modification changed either their therapeutic value or it enhanced and made the drug extremely lethal. We were able to take some of those drugs and make them therapeutic at dose 1x and lethal at dose 2x. You want to be very careful with cardiotonics. After that 2-year experience, I went to Abbott Laboratories in Chicago, Illinois, and worked for 4 years with them in their medical diagnostics division. There I invented new biomolecules for that division, biomolecules that were used to produce blood tests in the hospital market. After that, I went to
What were you testing for in your blood test?
Oh, things that you might not like. Pregnancy test. And human thyroid hormone, prolactin hormone. And we had a very successful unit. In fact, I also headed up a group that was a new technology group looking to produce some of these tests in the home market so that they could be a home pregnancy test, for instance. And we had worked with, very carefully with new techniques in delivery where you could do mass amounts of protein attached to small plastic particles. So I learned a lot about material science there as well. And that is why I was hired through headhunters to come to Minnesota to look at a job that was produced by Sanofi Diagnostics Pasteur, which is a French company in Minneapolis. And